Hello and thanks for joining me today. My name is Vivek Tandon. I'm the founder and CEO of EB5 BRICS LLC. I'm a U.S. licensed lawyer and investment banker, and I'm here today to educate you about EB5 U.S. Investor Visa Program. What is EB5? The U.S. government administers this program called EB5 Immigrant Investor Visa Program, which allows foreign investors to immigrate to the U.S. through an investment. This program actually started back in 1990 and in recent years has been immensely successful both for foreign investors as well as the U.S. economy. Through this program, the U.S. government makes available 10,000 green cards every year for qualified immigrant investors. The policy behind the Investor Visa Program is really to create a win-win situation for both the foreign investors as well as the U.S. economy. Through this program, the U.S. economy gets the capital that some of its communities need to really stimulate the local economy and the local employment, and at the same time allows foreign investors to immigrate to the U.S. for a variety of reasons, whether it's for family, business, or otherwise. So what are the requirements of EB5 visa? Now, three basic requirements must be met. You must make an investment into a new business, and the investment must be at least $1 million, or in certain cases, $500,000. And the investment must create 10 full-time U.S. jobs. Now, if you look at the EB5 visa program, generally speaking, most EB5 investments are at the $500,000 mark and not the $1 million mark. There are plenty of investment types available in the U.S. that qualify for the $500,000 threshold. And shortly, I'll go into why in certain cases the investment is $500,000 and not $1 million. Now, how does an investor really make an EB5 investment? So there's two different options that are available to EB5 applicants. One is called the direct investment. The other is called a regional center investment. So we'll talk about both today. So let's talk about option one, a direct EB5 investment. It's really investment in a new business and creation of 10 full-time jobs. And when I say direct EB5 investment, really pretty much means you're directly investing into an actual real operating business. And remember I talked about this earlier where I said it could either be $1 million or $500,000. The reason the threshold is lowered to $500,000 or $500,000 is because if the business is situated in a targeted employment area, then the investment amount is lowered to $500,000. A targeted employment area is really an area where the unemployment rate is really 150% of the national average rate, or it could also be a rural area. Now, if you look at most EB5 investments, as I said previously, are actually at the $500,000 level, and quite a few areas throughout the U.S. qualify for the $500,000 investment, whether it's a direct EB5 or whether it's a regional center EB5. In terms of the types of direct EB5 investments, generally speaking, most direct EB5 investments are franchises, restaurants, perhaps a small IT company, perhaps a small retail chain of stores, perhaps it's a trucking company or a car wash. But just keep in mind, regardless of the type of direct EB5 investment an investor makes, you have to create those 10 full-time jobs. So as a practical matter, if you say, well, I want to open up a gas station, think about whether you think that gas station or that one gas station can actually create, sustain, and maintain 10 full-time jobs or not. Most gas stations that I've actually personally seen don't tend to create more than maybe 3 to 5 full-time jobs. Now, if you had multiple locations and each of those locations are located in the targeted employment areas where the investment threshold is $500,000, then yes, you can actually accumulate um, those 10 jobs across multiple locations, and that would qualify for an EB5. Similarly for restaurants, if one restaurant cannot maintain or sustain 10 full-time jobs, then perhaps if you have multiple locations and you get to 10 employees at a minimum, then that would qualify for a direct EB5. I meet a lot of people all over India, and there's quite a few immigrant investors that are interested in the direct EB5 investments. I always sort of tell them that there's some major considerations that you should take into account. It's definitely doable, but it does come with a set of challenges. And I've sort of listed some of the challenges or some of the considerations that one should think about when they're considering a direct EB5. Generally speaking, uh, the successful direct EB5s that I've seen or come across are where there's a good business opportunity and it's a viable business opportunity that has the potential to sustain and thrive, and then also create and maintain 10 full-time jobs over at least 2 to 3 year period. And shortly, when we go into the timelines of the EB5 program, we'll talk about why these need to be maintained over at least a 2 to 3 year period. The second consideration is, well, if you do open up a business in the U.S. and say while your petition is pending for an EB5, how do you run that business? Say even if you have a B1, B2 visitors or business visa, you can always come here and visit your business, but you can't work in that business. So there's that limitation or restriction. There are other avenues that might be available to overcome that. Um, so there are other options that you could explore, but again, that is something one should consider, especially if they're fully occupied with their either their current job or their current business, back in the home country. Another consideration that you should think about, or an investor should think about, is getting approval for the I-526 immigration petition for alien entrepreneur. So that is the initial application that an investor files in order to get an EB5. Now, if you just file an EB5 application along with an EB5 compliant business plan, but there are no real operations in place, the business hasn't started, the employees haven't been hired, there are literally no operations whatsoever, would you get approved for that I-526? Or are the visa officers at USCIS, which is the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, the agency that is in charge of the EB5 program, that oversees the EB5 program, will they be satisfied with just a business plan and an investment hasn't been made, employees haven't been hired, business hasn't been started? So that is a major consideration to take into account when one is thinking about a direct EB5. Now, there are ways around that. Again, perhaps an investor can start that business, on their B1, B2 visitor's visa prior to filing the I-526. But then, again, the solution there would be perhaps the investor can find a local partner, perhaps a competent and trustworthy manager or a CEO, since the investor would be waiting for that approval to take place in their home country. So there are these kinds of considerations that one needs to take into account when thinking about a direct EB5. Let's move on to option 2, a regional center investment. So what is a regional center? A regional center is basically a private company. It's involved in the promotion of economic growth, job creation, and capital investment into the U.S. economy. So generally speaking, a regional center is usually a private company. There's a lot of information on the internet where it might indicate otherwise, that perhaps a regional center is a public-private company, or it could be a public-private partnership, but it's generally not owned by a public entity or a governmental entity. So one has to be sort of cognizant of the fact that a regional center is really an economic entity, which is a private company that is involved in raising capital for EB5 projects. So how does an entity become a regional center? It does have to apply to the USCIS for regional center approval. It has to show the following things. How that particular regional center plans to focus on a specific geographical region within the United States, and how are they going to go about promoting economic growth in that region. And again, how in verifiable details, meaning they might have to submit business plans and economic reports and job creation models showing how a particular type of investment in a particular area will create and stimulate that local economy and create jobs. Sort of regional center investments that I spoke about earlier, large mixed-use development projects or commercial development projects or residential development projects, those do tend to create. Before we go into that, I do want to talk about one more point, which is actually a key point when it comes to regional center investments. Now, there's about 800 approved regional centers in the country, and any given day, those 800 regional centers in the country will likely have, I would say, about 600 odd EB5 projects in the market. No two projects tend to be the same. Each project carries its own degree of risk. There are low risk projects, there are medium risk projects, there are high risk projects, and how you classify them into one of those risk categories really through, taking into account a lot of factors that go into that particular project, and in terms of who the regional center is and whatnot. And I'll shortly go into those factors as well. But but most regional center projects that you'll see in the market tend to be low or no return. When I say low or no return, I'm really talking about perhaps a 1% return on investment, perhaps 0.5%. Seen it up to 5 or 6% generally, but there are projects in the market that might promise or project 7 or 8% return. Just sort of remember the rule of thumb that I like to follow is, the higher the return is, the higher the risk may be. So you do have to be careful about that. But it's not to say that just because a project has low returns that it is low risk. That's not necessarily true. And hence, you should think about engaging professionals to help you make a fully informed decision when it comes to a regional center investment. So when we look at a regional center investment, what are the various factors that one should take into account? Or how does one go about selecting a regional center investment? One, I said you should definitely take advice from a financial or investment advisor. Because you are putting at least $500,000 at risk, and perhaps if you're taking the $1 million route, then you're putting $1 million at risk for the next 5 to 6 years. So I always suggest to people that yes, you do need an immigration lawyer to help you on the legal side, but at the same time, you should take help from a financial person to help you make that decision, because there's a lot of things that they can look at in terms of the financial due diligence, the immigration due diligence, and the regulatory due diligence to help you really make a fully informed decision. So generally speaking, when one is looking at a regional center investment, these are the sorts of things that one should be looking at. The regional center team and track record. Say if it's a long-established regional center, then how many projects have they done? How many I-526 approvals have they had? How many I-829 approvals have they had? How many projects that they've actually overseen has actually returned capital back to the investors? Now, again, that's not the only factor one should look at in terms of deciding what regional center investment they're going to put their $500,000 into, but it's one of the factors. Because at the end of the day, it's really not the regional center that's returning the investors' money, it's the developer, who's the borrower of that $500,000 along with funds from other investors, that is going to be signing that loan agreement and saying, he or she will return, say $10 million or $20 million from 40 EB5 investors in 5 to 6 years. So yes, one should look at a regional center track record, but at the same time, it's really the developer or the borrower that one should be really be looking at and seeing whether they have the capacity to return that capital and how they're going to go about returning that capital when it comes due. And then what kind of projects has that developer done in the past? What kind of success rates have they had in the past? have they done any other projects, through the EB5 program before or not? So those are some of the things that one should look at. Also, not to go too deep into this, but because you are a lender into that project, what is your position in relation to other lenders in that project? So say it's a $100 million project, perhaps 20 million came from the developer themselves, and perhaps there's a $50 million loan from a bank, and then the rest 30 million was raised through 60 EB5 investors. Now, obviously there's a bank there, so the bank might have first position in that loan, meaning if something were to go wrong in that project, then the bank would have the first right to foreclose into that project. Of course, this all depends on the terms of the loan, but they would be the ones who would be in a position to perhaps get some of their money back if there's enough collateral there. And if EB5 investors are in a second position, unless there's something left over, they're not going to get anything back. So that's another thing that EB5 investors should be looking at. And of course, financial viability of the project. Do a fair amount of financial analysis, or have your financial professional share with you the types of financial analysis that they've done, and what kind of risks that they've come across. The next is regulatory compliance. So in the U.S., there's two agencies that oversee a lot of capital raising activities. So one is the Securities and Exchange Commission, and one is FINRA, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. More and more, these two agencies are taking a very close look at the EB5 program. And there's quite a few regional centers in the country now that are actually embracing the fact that the SEC and FINRA are asking them to be compliant with securities laws of the U.S., and hence they're engaging securities broker-dealers in the U.S. To help them raise this kind of capital. And of course, there are regional centers in the country who don't think that they need to comply with SEC and FINRA because these are what they call exempt securities. Again, without going too much into the technicalities of what's an exempt security and what's not, because it really depends on who you ask. But nonetheless, again, as an investor, if you're risking $500,000 for the next 5 to 6 years, you want to make sure that the developer or the borrower or the regional center is in full compliance of all U.S. laws and not really operating in the gray areas of the law. Another sort of big factor that one should be looking at is the regional center's relationship with the developer or the borrower. More and more developers are rushing to become regional centers themselves. There is actually an inherent conflict with that. There are good developers and there are not so good developers in the market. So some investors are comfortable with that conflict, some are not, but that is another factor that you should be looking at. And of course, the job creation model for the project. At the end of the day, the reason an investor is making that investment is so that they can get their temporary green card and then eventually get their permanent green card. And that's completely contingent upon the project creating the required number of jobs. So job creation model, analysis of that model is definitely necessary. There are what they call pre-approved projects in the market, and these are projects where the developer or the borrower and the regional center have submitted the documents, a business plan, the economic report to the U.S. government even before an investor has filed their I-526 on that project. And the U.S. government has approved those projects, and in approving those projects agreed that yes, the business plan makes sense, yes, the job creation model makes sense. Again, they're not endorsing the projects or anything like that. They're just saying, yes, if all these things were to happen, in this particular geographic area, and you were to spend this amount of money, yes, we think this amount of jobs will be created. And the next is, again, the Economist report is really related to the job creation model. The immigration compliant business plan is closely tied to the job creation model. So all of these things are things that one should be looking at when making a decision as to which particular regional center that they should be investing in. I mentioned you're risking your $500,000 for the next 5 to 6 years if you were to pick a regional center investment that follows the loan model. A lot of time there's a lot of confusion about what is an at-risk investment. there must be a risk of loss or a chance of gain, simply put. I always tell people that at risk does not necessarily mean risky unless you want it to be. There are plenty of projects in the market which, because of one factor or several factors, may be perceived as high risk. And perhaps to compensate for that, they might be offering you a higher return. But at the end of the day, it's a call that an investor needs to make in terms of the amount of risk that they're willing to take. And EB5 law requires that your investment be at risk. So if anybody ever tells you that this is a risk-free investment or a risk-free project, or we've eliminated 100% of the risk, they're just misrepresenting the facts to you. There is no such thing as a no-risk investment because EB5 projects or EB5 investments need to be at-risk investments for them to qualify under the EB5 program. Just going a little bit deeper into the job creation piece. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that each and every EB5 applicant is required to create at least 10 full-time jobs. Now, if you go the direct investment route, you have an obligation to create and maintain those 10 full-time jobs until you get your permanent green card. And if you do a regional center investment, then the regional center and the developer have the burden, but you're the one who still has to show the proof that those jobs were indeed created from your $500,000 investment. And again, in a regional center framework, the regional centers and the developers will provide you with those types of documentation. And you might notice in the first bullet point there that every EB5 applicant shall be required to create or preserve at least 10 full-time jobs. The preserve piece comes in when, say, an investor does not necessarily invest into a new business. Perhaps they invest into an existing business. Now, an existing business may qualify for an EB5 given that it's a troubled business. So say if you rescue a business that's in the danger of closing or that's been in losses for a number of years and it's in danger of losing jobs. And let's say if there's a hotel, and perhaps in Southern California where I live. In fact, I'm actually talking from a real-world example where there was an Egyptian client who identified a property in California that was in losses and it was in danger of shutting down, and they were going to lose about 10 or 12 full-time jobs because of that. So they came in and they actually rescued that property and put in new management and did some other things that turned the whole business around. And instead of creating 10 new jobs, they actually saved 10 or 12 existing jobs, and that helped them qualify for an EB5. Now, they did that through the direct EB5 route, but again, there's obviously a level of risk that they took on when they rescued a troubled business. They actually ended up putting in more than $500,000. And they did have about 25 plus years of experience back in their home country in running hotels and motels, and they had a very strong support system in place here in California. So I think that contributed immensely to their success. So again, going back to my initial thought about direct investments, they're doable, but they're challenging. But if you have the right strategies and solutions in place, they can definitely work. Now, moving on to the EB5 process and timelines. Again, I can't stress enough that an EB5 application should really be handled by a team of professionals. Professionals who know legal, who know financial, who know investments. There are various stages in this process, and there are various things that one needs to take into account when doing an EB5. Now, simply put, there's two sides to an EB5 really. There's the investment side and there's the immigration side, and both of those sides need to come together to make sure that you have sort of an airtight application. And generally speaking, those two things can generally take about 1 to 2, sometimes 2 to 3 months to get together. And once you have those two things together, meaning you have an investment identified and you've got the immigration side taken care of in terms of making sure that the EB5 investment meets all of the immigration law requirements, making sure the source of funds for that $500,000 has been properly and thoroughly documented, And of course, you've done all of the due diligence that you needed to do on that investment. So those two things come together, and then the investor submits an I-526 application, and these funds, that are part of that application, can be the investor's own money. And right now, as the law stands, it does allow for a loan or gift funds. The loan has to be a secured loan. It cannot be secured against that EB5 investment, and or it could be a gift. It could be a parent giving gifts to a son or a daughter. Actually, quite a few of our clients are parents in their home country whose children are attending colleges or universities in the U.S., and they're either graduating soon from their bachelor's degree programs or their master's degree programs, or they've already graduated and they're on some sort of a temporary work visa, and they don't necessarily wish to go back to their home country. They want to settle permanently in the U.S. So we've got quite a few parents who are basically funding an EB5 application for their U.S.-based son or daughter. Now, as I said, once you complete your due diligence with the help of experienced U.S.-based and U.S. licensed, I would highly recommend financial and investment advisors and lawyers, then the investment is made, the I-526 petition is filed, and on average, an I-526 petition takes about 12 to 14 months currently. Now that time period can change. It can go up, it can go down. It really depends on the number of resources the USCIS has in place, and obviously the number of applicants that are filing through the EB5 program. So say once the I-526 is approved in, say, approximately 12 to 14 months, then an investor is issued a conditional green card. Conditional green card is pretty much the same exact thing as a permanent green card. It gives you the same rights and privileges. You can work anywhere in the country, you can travel, and you can travel back and forth from your home country. So there's no restrictions per se. It's just that the conditional green card, the validity of that conditional green card is about 2.5 years. And also, it's actually conditional upon your investment creating those 10 full-time jobs. So say you get your conditional green card status. What happens next? Well, once the conditional green card is issued, then you can obviously enter the United States. And once you enter the United States, you're here for about 2 years or so, because that's what the conditional green card is valid for. At the end of those 2 years, you've got to get documentation. Say you made a regional center investment, then you've got to get documentation from the regional center showing how your investment created those 10 full-time jobs. And you would file what they call an I-829 application. And once you file that application, then you're basically waiting for that application to be decided upon by the USCIS. And once it's approved, then you're given your permanent green card. Now, in terms of processing times, the I-829 right now is taking up to 12 to 14 months, or even more, in fact, that I noticed recently. The good thing is, while your I-29 is pending, your conditional green card status gets automatically extended. So the processing times, yes, it affects you, but it doesn't necessarily make a difference in terms of your legal status in the country. But say your I-29 is processed and it's decided upon and it's approved, then you get a permanent green card. Now, the entire time period, you can really think about it in terms of a total time period would be, say, 3.5 to 4 years before you have a permanent green card. Because remember what I said, it could take 2 to 3 months to get the investment and the immigration site together and file that I-526 application, which could take 12 to 14 months to adjudicate. So we're already at, say, a year and a half, and then you're in conditional green card status for an additional 2 years. And so that's already 3.5 years. And when you file your I-29 application, say it even just takes 6 months. So you're already at the 4-year mark in terms of, before you get your permanent green card. And moving over to the investment side, you make the investment, at the time of the I-526 application. In fact, you can't file your I-526 application unless you've made that investment, especially when you're going to the regional center route. because the regional center will then issue you a participation certificate, which becomes a part of your I-526 application. And once the application is filed, your investment is made. And again, that investment term could be 5 years or 6 years. Once you get your permanent green card, you're essentially waiting about perhaps 1 or 2 years to really get your money back. What is the next sort of step after the permanent green card? So say you get your permanent green card and in 5 to 6 years, you get your money back. Once you've been a U.S. resident, meaning in green card status, both conditional and permanent, for at least 5 years, you can actually qualify for U.S. citizenship. And there are some residency requirements and there are some physical presence requirements before you can qualify for U.S. citizenship. But generally speaking, once you've been living in the U.S. for approximately 5 years on green card status, you can apply for U.S. citizenship. And of course, there's a lot of questions that I get in terms of, well, great, I get my permanent green card, and then you say, I'm just waiting for my money to be returned to me in 5 to 6 years. How do I actually get that money back? Well, it goes back to that regional center investment. And again, I focus on the regional center investment part because a majority, well, more than a majority, as I said, 90 to 95% of all EB5 applicants usually choose the regional center route. Now, every regional center project is going to have an exit strategy, meaning how are they going to return the money back to the EB5 investors. There's usually two different strategies that they'll have. When I say different, they could have option 1 and option 2. And option 1 could be that they sell the project entirely. And whatever proceeds they get from selling that project, they use those proceeds to pay off the EB5 loan. And again, we're assuming here that the proceeds of that sale exceed the amount of money that they owe, say, to a bank and to the EB5 investors. So assuming that everything went well in the project and the economy is doing well, and say a project was $100 million when it was built and now it's $125 million, then if the project is sold for $125 million, then there should be sufficient funds to pay back the EB5 investors as well as any other lenders to that project. So that's one option. Second option in terms of an exit is generally refinancing the EB5 loan. So again, same scenario, say it's a $100 million project, and at that time, there's 20 million from the developer, there's 50 million from a bank, and there's 30 million from EB5 investors. Now, in 5 or 6 years, say that project is worth, again, $125 million. Now, it might be much easier for that project or that developer to get a second loan from a second bank because now the value has gone up quite a bit for that particular project, in which case there's a less amount of risk that the second bank is taking because there's more equity in that particular project, and hence the second loan from a second bank can then pay off the loan that the EB5 investors made. I'm talking in very general terms here. There's a lot more details to this. There's a lot of other things that one needs to be looking at. But for today's purposes, I just wanted to at least give you some of the common points, some of the commonly asked questions, and just information and education about the EB5 program and about the kinds of things that an investor should be thinking about when they're considering an EB5 application. So please don't take anything I say today to be set in stone. There's a lot of variables that come into play. But again, I just wanted to give you some general information about the EB5 program. Go to the benefit side of having an EB5 green card. Well, again, an EB5 the EB5 Visa Program allows a direct route to permanent residency in the U.S. For the investor, his or her spouse, and any children under the age of 21. And again, the investor can live anywhere in the country, work anywhere in the country, retire anywhere in the country. Investor and their spouse and their children can attend college or university at U.S. resident costs instead of a foreign student cost. And again, there are certain other conditions that need to be met there, but generally speaking, that's a benefits that's derived directly from having a green card through the EB5 program. and of course the freedom to travel, to and from the U.S. without a visa. And as I said, after 5 years of permanent residency, if the investor meets or if the resident meets certain conditions, they can apply for U.S. citizenship. And quite a few investors actually that I deal with will do this, where they invest $500,000 through a regional center to take care of the immigration piece, and then to really make money in the U.S., they might get an additional a business from other funds that they might have. So again, if you're a green card holder in the U.S., you can go work for somebody else, or you can work for yourself. You can start a business, and there's no compulsion there for you to create or maintain 10 full-time jobs because it's not related to your EB5 application. And eventually, say if an investor holds a green card, they can apply for their family members as well. The wait there is quite a wait. It's about 10 to 15 years, generally speaking, for most of the countries out there because of visa availability issues. But if one does become a U.S. citizen, then generally immediate relatives, so parents, can be brought over to the U.S. In green card status in usually 6 to 12 months. So there are other kinds of benefits there as well. Now, just to wrap up things today, I do want to sort of emphasize that anything that you've heard or read today should not be construed as legal advice. Again, I'm just here today to educate you and inform you. I don't know what your personal goals are, what your personal situations are, so I'm not giving any legal advice to anybody here. And of course, there's no attorney-client relationship that is established between you and I, Vivek Tandon, or EB5 BRICS LLC by downloading, reading, or listening to this presentation. Again, this presentation is strictly for information purposes only. And of course, there's no offer to sell any security or investment made through this presentation or anything that I've said today. And again, going back to my point about today's presentation being very general in nature, if anybody here wants to know more about or learn more about the EB5 program, I'm happy to educate them more. My phone number is on the screen. My email address is on the screen. Again, I just want to sort of give you an idea of my background. It's right there on the screen. But again, I'm a U.S. licensed lawyer and banker. I'm actually licensed through FINRA and the Securities and Exchange Commission. And I'm associated with a registered broker-dealer called NMS Capital Advisors. It's a Beverly Hills, California-based bank. And that's the bank that represents the investors that we place into various EB5 projects. Thank you, and I look forward to talking to you more if anybody needs more information.